the point that
you know what's so funny? I just had a revelation. Oh, I just had a revelation. We're talking about people who were born as late as 64, right? So 64 plus 20 years is 84. So if you're 20 and 84, we're talking about the 80s generation, which is also coincidentally the generation that people kind of love a lot.
That people what?
Remember, I Love the 80s? It was like this popular show that was like on VH1. The 80s is like for a lot of us right now, the 80s was the great generation. You know, what's his name just died? Carl Weatherspoon. You know, 80s was Rocky and all that stuff. Action Jackson.
No,
bro, the 70s and the 80s were the boomer playland. Let's be real.
There you go. There you go.
Let's be real. Nobody says it, but it's the truth. And all that 70s shit, the boomers was getting into mad hedonism. Studio 54, all that shit. Those motherfuckers are parents. Low key was having orgies and all the same shit Diddy's doing.
Let's be real. Crack was everywhere.
Right. All the way since Woodstock. I'll give you that. But here's where I want to give Hood. Do we like the 80s and early 90s? Yes, right? Because that's where culture ended. I did a whole stream yesterday about what did we miss about Mississippi? Because you got to understand, all the criminals came from Mississippi. They moved to Chicago and Detroit and Cleveland, but grandma stayed in Mississippi, right? I was like, why do we ignore Mississippi? So I did this whole show about it. Yep. And they went to all these small towns that are abandoned, right? The cotton gin, fell off, they automated whatever. And everybody said, yo, this was it looked like slavery, right? Like everybody sitting on a milk carton, a milk crate, drinking beer. Like it looked like slavery, right? It looked like Jim Crow. And when you ask the people, yo, when did the town fall off? Whether it was a white town in Mississippi or a black town in Mississippi, they all said the mid-1980s. So you have to think about this. Who was in control in the mid-1980s? The boomers. The boomers had the greatest minstrels ever. All minstrel art, all arts and crafts, that's boomers because they perpetual toddlers, right? Of course they can sing and color shit because they little kids in their head, right? They all got So yeah, art was good, but there has been no innovation in America because we're talking about in 1986.
Whoa,
you had to program. Did you say the 80s was the end of culture, dirty folks?
Yes.
No, that's not true.
Bro,
what? Yeah, no, talk about that a little bit. Talk about that,
bro. These motherfuckers still rapping. There has never been a generation with a 20-year gap that didn't invent a new music. We are stuck in perpetual 80s. We have never, technology has grown, but as a culture, we're stuck in 1980.
He's right about that in that sense. Yeah, because all the shit that even Gen Z do, they be recreating the stuff from the 80s and 90s. Let's be real. In the 90s, when you think about the end of a generation, right? The next 20 years into a new decade is really still the old decade. So if you look at the beginning of the 80s, it's really the 1970s. Do you guys follow that? Am I making sense? Because it takes about 20 years.
Yeah,
exactly. So
right. So exactly. What happened? Right. Let's use culture as a barometer. Right. From when slavery came out, you had chain music, right? Chain gang music. In the 1900s, you had barbershop quartets. In the 1920s, you had blues. In the 1940s and 50s, they made jazz. 1960s, rock and roll, P-funk. House music, right? 1980s rap. We still rapping. Niggas still wearing Jordans. Them Jordans came out in 1984. I remember begging my mom for a pair. I was in elementary school. Motherfuckers still wearing the Jordan 1s. Like, there has been no pushing culture. It's like they're just refining 1980 over and over.
So would you group the 90s in there too? So 90s?
People they never changed since 1984.
1990s was when we came to the apex of what came out in 1980, right? But it's still the 1980s influence, right? 1980s created fashion.
So I'm a millennial, so the 90s is basically all I know. I don't know the 80s.
The 90s was the most refined 1980s. That's what I'm saying. 1990s, you was watching a different world. The Cosby Show came out in 1980. 1990s, Michael Jordan was a champion, but his shoes came out in 1980.
Yeah, but I think the 90s, you got to give it I think you should give it to the 90s versus the 80s because the things that are still here
came from the 90s because it was refined in the 90s, but it was created in the 80s. You understand what I'm saying?
I do.
Like 1990s was my day. Like I was a teenager in the 1990s, right? That was my day. So I'm with you, and I watched the refinement. I watched.
You know, it's funny, right? Because ever since the late 90s, we've been living in the era of the remake. We've just been remaking everything from the 80s and 90s over and over. The 70s and 80s been getting remade over and over.
Well, the 90s was when we were introduced.
Hey, speaking, we talk about Diddy. Did you know Diddy invented the remix?
He invented the remix. It's Diddy's fault. It's Diddy's fault that culture has expressed.
It's kind of deep.